The rain fell like shattered glass from the heavens that night, sharp, relentless, and unforgiving. The roads outside the city twisted into black rivers, slick with oil and storm water. Most drivers pulled to the side, headlights cutting weak beams through the torrent, praying to make it home alive. But Daniel Whitmore was not most drivers. He had always been the kind of man who believed storms could be outrun, whether in business, in life, or on nights like this one. His black Mercedes cut through the downpour, tires slicing water like knives. He had left his office late, shoulders heavy with the weight of negotiations, the kind his partners had insisted only Daniel could close. He never noticed the second car. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror too close, too fast. Before Daniel could react, the vehicle swerved alongside him, forcing his car toward the guardrail. The scream of twisting metal drowned in the thunder. His Mercedes skidded across the slick asphalt, smashing against steel, then flipping once, twice, before tumbling down the embankment. The world went black in less than a heartbeat. When the authorities arrived, they wrote it off as an unfortunate accident, another casualty of a stormy night, nothing unusual. But for Eleanor Whitmore, nothing about it felt natural. She remembered the phone call, at 2 a.m., the officer's clipped tone, the hesitation before saying the words, "Your husband didn't make it." She remembered the way her coffee cup slipped from her hands that morning, shattering across the kitchen floor, milk and ceramic pooling like blood. Grief came, heavy and suffocating, but alongside it, a colder, sharper feeling grew doubt. At the funeral, the church pews were lined with polished shoes and black suits. The air smelled of lilies and rain-drenched wool. Eleanor, dressed in widow's black, kept her gaze lowered, face pale, fragile, broken for the world to see. But her eyes saw everything. Victor, Raymond, Charles Daniels' three closest business partners sat together in the front pew. They shook hands, bowed their heads, muttered words of comfort, yet their eyes never truly grieved. Victor's smirk lingered too long, curling at the edge of his mouth as though a private joke whispered only to himself. Raymond checked his watch too often, restless, as if waiting for the funeral to end so he could return to something more pressing. And Charles avoided Eleanor's gaze entirely, staring at the coffin with the indifference of a man who had already moved on. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, Eleanor felt her knees buckle. Friends whispered that grief had made her weak, but deep inside, it was not weakness that shook her, it was rage. That night, alone in her bedroom, she replayed every detail. Daniel's voice the evening before, calm yet oddly distracted. The sudden business trip his partners had urged him to attend. The storm that just happened to keep him late. Too many coincidences, too much silence. As the storm outside faded, a storm within Eleanor began to rise. She whispered to the empty room, this was no accident. And though no one could hear her, she knew the truth had already planted its seed. A seed that would one day grow into something merciless. Something her husband's so-called friends could never imagine. The city forgot Daniel Whitmore quickly. Within weeks, the newspapers that once printed his smiling face shifted to fresher headlines. His name, once spoken with reverence in business circles, was reduced to whispers of pity, another successful man taken too soon by fate. But fate had nothing to do with it. Only Eleanor knew that. To the world, she was the portrait of devastation. She wore black every day, veils shading her pale face, lips trembling at the mention of Daniel's name. She cried in public, hands clutching tissues, shoulders shuddering with grief. Neighbors brought casseroles, acquaintances offered condolences, and board members sighed sympathetically as she excused herself from meetings, too overcome to speak. But behind closed doors, the mask slipped. Late at night, when the world believed her drowned in sorrow, Eleanor locked herself in Daniel's study. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, cedarwood, and tobacco. His leather chair groaned under her weight as she pulled open drawers he once kept closed. At first, it was small things she noticed. Unusual bank withdrawals, unsigned contracts, memos written in a hand not his own. Then came the larger cracks. Forged signatures, missing pages in official minutes, loans tied to companies that didn't exist. It was as though Daniel's empire had been hollowed out piece by piece, the marrow drained until only a brittle shell remained. And the fingerprints on the crime weren't Daniel's, they belonged to the men who had carried his coffin. Victor, with his insatiable gambling debts. Raymond, always chasing a bigger slice of every deal. And Charles, the man Daniel had once called his brother. Eleanor began to write. At first, it was notes scribbled on scraps of paper, numbers, dates, names. Then, she brought out a leather-bound notebook, plain and unmarked. On the first page, in a hand steadier than she expected, she wrote 3 words: the ledger. Each page became a dossier, photographs clipped from magazines, photocopies of bank slips, whispers gathered from servants and secretaries. She mapped their sins like an architect designing a cathedral of ruin. But knowledge alone was not enough. She knew appearances were her greatest weapon, so Eleanor played her part flawlessly. At luncheons, she dabbed her eyes with handkerchiefs, speaking softly of how empty the house felt without Daniel. At board dinners, she bowed her head, claiming she understood little of business, grateful to the partners for carrying on Daniel's legacy. They believed her, they pitied her, and that was their mistake. In private, Eleanor trained herself. She studied financial reports until numbers sang like music in her head. She read case studies of corporate sabotage, books on manipulation, memoirs of con artists and spies. Her grief became discipline, her despair sharpened into patience. Months passed, then a year. By then, people had stopped checking in on the widow. Her friends urged her to remarry, to move forward, but Eleanor wasn't moving forward. She was digging deeper. Every smile she gave in public was another veil, another shield. They thought she was harmless, but beneath the mask, she was becoming something far more dangerous. One night, Eleanor stood at the study window, watching rain streak down the glass just as it had the night Daniel died. She opened the ledger, flipping through pages filled with secrets that could ruin empires. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, not the grieving widow, but the woman who would one day burn Daniel's betrayers to ash. With a soft, almost tender smile, Eleanor whispered, "Let them underestimate me," and she closed the ledger with a snap that sounded, to her, like the closing of a coffin. The study had become her sanctuary. What was once Daniel's domain, the shelves lined with ledgers, the mahogany desk polished by years of late-night work, now belonged to her. But Eleanor had repurposed it. No longer a room of balance sheets and quarterly reports, it had become a war room. At its heart sat a single object, the leather-bound book she had named The Ledger. By candlelight, Eleanor bent over the pages, ink staining her fingertips, her handwriting precise and cold. Each entry was not merely information, it was a judgment, a death sentence waiting to be carried out. On one page, Victor Mallory. Beneath his name, lists of casino debts, whispers of affairs, photographs of IOUs written in his trembling hand. Eleanor wrote beside it, weakness, vice. On another, Raymond Shaw. She detailed his hunger for expansion, the trail of underpaid contractors, the lawsuits hushed with bribes. Next to his name, weakness, greed, and finally, Charles Whitmore. Not by blood, but close enough that Daniel had called him brother. His betrayal cut the deepest. Eleanor listed his offshore accounts, his shell companies, his duplicity masked by charm. Next to his name, weakness, ego. Each page she filled was like laying a brick in the monument of her vengeance. But Eleanor was no fool. She knew revenge could not be rushed. To strike too early was to invite suspicion, and suspicion could unravel everything. No, this would be a campaign, not a skirmish. A slow burn, like a fuse winding toward inevitable detonation. She spent her days perfecting the mask. She attended charity events, always soft-spoken, always grateful when Victor or Raymond offered helpful advice about her late husband's estate. She acted lost in board meetings, pretending to misread numbers, letting them believe she was out of her depth. The more they underestimated her, the sharper her blade became. By night, she studied them like a hunter studies prey. Victor's trips to the casino became her entertainment. She followed his patterns, learned the names of the women he visited, memorized the excuses he gave his wife. Raymond's restless ambition led him into risky ventures, and Eleanor, through quiet inquiries and anonymous tips, knew more about his shaky investments than his own accountants. But Charles was different. He was cautious, careful, a man who had built his power not only on cunning but on charm. Eleanor knew he would be the hardest to break, and so she saved him for last. Her pen hovered over the final page of the ledger. At the top, in bold ink, she wrote a single phrase, mercy denied. Because she had already decided when the time came, she would not grant them the mercy they had denied Daniel. There would be no quick ruin, no chance for redemption. Their endings would be long, humiliating, and absolute. Still, in the quiet hours before dawn, Eleanor sometimes wondered if she was becoming something unrecognizable. She would trace Daniel's handwriting on old letters, remembering his laughter, his warmth, the way he believed people could be better than they seemed. And then she would see his coffin lowered into the earth again in her mind, remember the smirks of the men who had orchestrated it all, and any softness inside her turned to steel. Grief had ended. Now came vengeance. As she closed the book that night, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. For the first time since Daniel's death, she did not feel like a widow. She felt like an executioner sharpening her blade, and though her enemies slept soundly in their beds, Eleanor knew the truth. Their nights of peace were numbered. By the second year of her widowhood, Eleanor had perfected her disguise. To society, she was still the fragile figure draped in black, a woman swallowed by loss. At charity auctions, she spoke in soft tones, letting others guide her. At luncheons, she laughed only politely, never drawing attention. Even her closest acquaintances whispered, "Poor Eleanor, she'll never recover." That was exactly what she wanted them to believe. Behind the curtains of the Whitmore mansion, however, the grieving widow no longer existed. In her place stood a strategist. Eleanor had learned to move like a shadow, silent, unremarkable, but always watching. The first step had been money. Daniel had left accounts scattered like breadcrumbs, some official, some hidden, even from his partners. Eleanor tracked them down patiently, piecing them together like fragments of a puzzle. Where the accounts had been drained, she traced the siphons. Where assets had been buried, she dug them up. With each discovery, she grew bolder. She began investing in small properties under false names, quiet acquisitions that nobody linked back to her. A struggling apartment building here, a failing antique shop there. While Victor and Raymond burned through millions chasing grand ventures, Eleanor built something slow, steady, and invisible. She also cultivated allies in silence. The secretary who had once adored Daniel now slipped her confidential documents. A junior accountant, overlooked and underpaid, became her eyes inside the company's finances. Even the doorman at the casino where Victor squandered fortunes learned to send her whispered updates. None of them knew the full picture. They only saw a widow seeking to protect her late husband's memory. But Eleanor knew better. She wasn't protecting Daniel's memory. She was weaponizing it. At night, she practiced more than numbers. She studied human behavior, the tics in a liar's smile, the hesitation in a guilty man's voice. She attended galas, not for company, but to observe who leaned too close when speaking, who drank too much when nervous, who betrayed secrets in careless whispers. The woman who once wept quietly in her kitchen had vanished. What remained was someone colder, sharper, a predator learning to stalk in plain sight. One evening, Eleanor stood before her mirror, slipping on a pearl necklace Daniel had once gifted her. For years, she had worn only mourning black, but tonight she chose dark crimson silk. She studied her reflection with an unfamiliar satisfaction. The world still saw a broken widow, but in the shadows, Eleanor Whitmore was becoming something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose, and an entire empire to dismantle. And in the ledger, 3 names waited patiently for her hand to strike. Victor Mallory was always the weakest link. His hunger for dice and cards had gnawed through his fortune faster than termites through rotting wood. Eleanor knew this because she had studied his every indulgence, his late-night visits to the casino, the women who laughed too sweetly at his table, the creditors who whispered his name with disdain. She didn't strike him head-on. That would have been clumsy. Instead, she slid into his life like smoke, invisible and suffocating. Her first move was Victor's estranged wife, Catherine. Eleanor befriended her over tea, wearing the mask of sympathy. She whispered truths. Catherine had always suspected that Victor's money fed mistresses, not their home. She slipped evidence into Catherine's hands, receipts, photographs, hotel ledgers. Soon, Catherine filed for divorce, tearing away Victor's last shield. Then Eleanor delivered the finishing blow. Through an anonymous letter, she tipped off investigators about Victor's laundering schemes. The trail was too obvious to ignore bank accounts swollen with dirty money, transfers disguised as debts. The law pounced, hungry for a scapegoat. Victor's empire collapsed overnight. His casino friends turned their backs, creditors swarmed, and his name became a headline smeared with disgrace. In her study, Eleanor opened the ledger. With slow, deliberate strokes, she drew a single black line through Victor Mallory's name. Her hand trembled not from guilt, but from exhilaration. For the first time, she tasted revenge, and it was intoxicating. Revenge was never quick. Eleanor knew that better than anyone. Months bled into years as she waited for her enemies to stumble into the traps she quietly laid. To the outside world, she was still the composed widow, attending church services, hosting quiet dinners, smiling faintly when neighbors asked if she was healing. But behind that calm face was a woman at war with herself. There were nights she lay awake until dawn, the silence pressing against her like a weight. Doubt whispered cruelly, "What if you fail? What if they outlive you?" She replayed Daniel's voice in her mind, soft and reassuring, telling her to let go. But then came the memory of his broken body, the smirks at the funeral, and her hesitation turned back into fury. Her patience had a cost. She lost friends who urged her to move on, who accused her of clinging too tightly to the past. She let them drift away. She could not afford distractions. She sacrificed comfort, love, even peace of mind, all for the ledger that guided her hand. And yet, with each passing year, her resolve grew sharper. She reminded herself, lions do not rush their prey. They wait until the herd is weakest. Victor was gone. 2 names remained bold and unbroken in her book, and Eleanor vowed they would not survive her patience. Raymond Shaw thrived on expansion. For him, enough was never enough. One deal only opened the door to the next, bigger one. He bragged at dinners about his brilliance, about the empires he was building, but Eleanor knew the truth. Greed is a snake that eventually eats its own tail. She became the whisper in the dark, anonymous tips sent to his board members, subtle rumors passed to investors over glasses of wine, whispers that Raymond was siphoning funds, betraying his own partners. None of it was entirely true, but none of it had to be. Suspicion did the work for her. Raymond began to see enemies everywhere. He fired trusted advisors, cut off allies, and demanded loyalty from men who no longer trusted him. His empire cracked from the inside. When Eleanor fed investigators a single document just enough to suggest fraud, the cracks split wide open. Lawsuits followed, then arrests. Raymond, once the loudest voice at every table, now sat silent behind prison glass, a broken man gnawing on the ruins of his greed. Eleanor opened the ledger. With steady hands, she drew another line. Raymond Shaw was gone. 2 down. 1 remained, and he was the most dangerous of all. By day, Eleanor was the perfect picture of quiet dignity. She attended charity galas in muted gowns, donated generously to hospitals in Daniel's name, and spoke softly of how grateful she was for her husband's partners who kept his legacy alive. People pitied her, admired her strength, and whispered about her saintly endurance. But by night, she was something else entirely. Behind the locked doors of her mansion, she pored over financial records and surveillance reports. The secret fortune she had built grew like a hidden empire, stretching through shell companies and shadow accounts. Each dollar was a weapon, each investment a trap waiting to spring. She had mastered the art of invisibility. Nobody questioned the widow who asked innocent questions at dinners, who listened more than she spoke. Yet with every nod, every smile, she was collecting intelligence, weaving a web around the last betrayer. In public, Eleanor remained the fragile widow. In private, she was sharpening the blade, and soon, Charles Whitmore would feel its edge. Eleanor believed she had mapped every betrayal, every lie, but one night, while combing through Daniel's old phone records, she found something that froze her blood, a familiar number called minutes before his fatal crash. It wasn't Victor, it wasn't Raymond, it wasn't even Charles. It was Richard Hale, a family friend who had dined at her table, toasted Daniel's birthdays, and once promised to look after Eleanor if anything happened. He had been bribed, paid to keep Daniel vulnerable that night, ensuring he traveled alone, ensuring no one would be there to save him. The revelation cut deeper than a knife. Trust itself felt poisoned. Eleanor stared at Richard's name scrawled into the ledger, her hand shaking. This wasn't just business betrayal anymore. It was personal. It was family. And if she needed proof that her path was righteous, this was it. The men who had destroyed Daniel had recruited the very people closest to him. Her revenge would be merciless. Charles Whitmore prided himself on caution, but even the cautious can be blinded by greed. Eleanor set the bait carefully. A lucrative development deal, whispered through intermediaries, cloaked behind layers of shell companies. The promise of vast profit was irresistible. Charles and his remaining allies pounced, pouring millions into what they believed was the crown jewel of their empire. They never saw Eleanor's hand in the shadows. Permits were forged, contracts designed to implode, and investors ready to vanish the moment the deal collapsed. Eleanor had engineered every detail, and when the collapse came, it was swift and brutal. Charles's reputation shattered in the press. His name, once gold in the industry, became poison overnight. Lawsuits circled, creditors demanded blood, and in the chaos, his remaining partners turned on him like wolves. From her study window, Eleanor watched the empire crumble. For the first time, she allowed herself a smile. The trap had closed, and Charles, the man Daniel once called brother, was caught at the center of it. Charles came to her doorstep, a broken man. Once proud, polished, and untouchable, he now looked hollow, eyes bloodshot, clothes disheveled, his voice trembling with desperation. He begged her for help, swore he had loved Daniel like a brother, pleaded that he never wanted things to end this way. Eleanor listened silently, her face calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She let him pour out excuses, apologies, promises of change. When at last his words crumbled into sobs, she rose and retrieved the ledger. She placed it on the table between them, slowly flipping to the final page. There, in black ink, was his name, Charles Whitmore. She tapped it once with her finger, then closed the book with a soft thud. Charles fell to his knees, whispering, "Please, mercy." But Eleanor only looked down at him, eyes cold as stone. "Mercy," she said, her voice steady, was the one thing Daniel never received. And with that, she turned her back, leaving Charles to drown in the ruin he had created. The house was silent. Only the crackle of the fireplace filled the room as Eleanor sat alone in Daniel's old study. Before her lay the ledger, its pages heavy with secrets, every betrayer's name crossed out in dark, final strokes. For years, she had lived for this moment, the moment when every debt was repaid, every wound avenged. And yet, as she stared at the closed book, she felt no peace, only emptiness. The world would never know her role in their downfall. The papers would write of bankruptcies, scandals, and disgrace. But only Eleanor knew the truth. She had been their judge, their executioner, and their ruin. Slowly, she locked the ledger away in the desk drawer, not destroyed but preserved, because vengeance, once written, never truly ends. Eleanor rose, her shadow stretching long across the room. She was no longer the grieving widow. She was the legacy of Daniel's justice, cold, patient, and eternal.